was that theme? Somebody, just yell it out.
Opportunity cost?
Opportunity cost,
Never
exactly.
let the government do anything.
What was that?
Never let the government do anything.
And never let the government, that's basically, and that's sort of my second point. Money should flow to where it would be most useful. So don't let the government to try to redirect where it should go. He really believes in like this kind of free flowing of the economy, and that it will things will naturally correct if you let them do it. So I have a little picture here, which is kind of what I think this author is getting at, and it will also come into play as we talk about next year's resolution. So his view is like supply and demand is kind of like a spigot and a drain hole, and there's a perfect amount of water going through that goes in the drain, so the drain doesn't plug up and the water flows over the edges of the sink, therefore wasting the water, and there's enough water going down the drain so that it continues to do whatever water goes down doing the drain drain. And so his view, the author's view, is that if you put any regulation on either the supply side or the demand side, you're kind of putting in artificial crimps in that flow of water to the drain. And so that is the thing that we have to be careful about, is that anytime the government adds something in to say, well, there's too much water coming out of the spigot, so let's put constraints on that. That causes problems on the water side, on the spigot side. Conversely, if there's too much things happening on the demand side, let's put constraints on that. That causes problems over there. And the author would say, hey, just take your hands off of both sides. Let the water drain down, and naturally, will naturally regulate. If there's too much water going through, the person who's pushing the water will actually say, oh, that's too much water, and I'll turn it down. Same with on the drain side. If there's too much water going to the drain side will get bigger or smaller depending on how much is coming through. The government should not be going in trying to crimp those things in between the drain and the spigot. So that's sort of the supply and demand kind of concept. And that's kind of the theme of the book, and that will be very important as we go into talking about this next year's resolution, which is about import and exports. Keep this picture in your mind about this kind of perfect balance between supply and demand. Okay, so this year's topic, that the United States federal government should significantly reform its import and or export policy. Is that going to be fun or what? So this is going to be interesting because there's going to be a lot of, I think, pulling in some of these economic theories that people are going to be, and I've talked about this last couple of weeks, which I know people have kind of suffered through and felt like, oh, what are we learning this for? A lot of the policies and rationales behind import and export laws are built off of the things that this author was talking about in terms of different fallacies that governments implement. I'll give you some examples here. Okay, so here's the world. And the United States is kind of like the largest drainage hole in the world. I mean, like so many goods and services come into the United States from all over. We're called a net importer. You guys know what an import is? Who can tell me what an import is?
Some good or service that comes into somewhere.
Okay. And what's the opposite of an import?
Export.
Right. An export is something that comes from our country, leaving our country, going to the world's drain hole. Okay? That's called an export. So this whole topic is about things coming into our country, goods and services, and the policies and laws that regulate that, and then things leaving our country, and then goods and services and things regulating that. And we will be debating, real quick here on the point on this. We are a net importer of goods, and you'll hear this thing called the trade deficit as we get further into the topic. You guys have already heard that term. And basically what that means is the blue water coming into our country is larger than the green water going out of our country. I mean, we're importing more stuff than we are exporting. And some people say that's good, some people say that's bad. There'll be this principle of comparative advantage. And it's an economic theory. Basically what it means is a person has a comparative advantage of producing something if he can produce it at a lower cost than anyone else. So somebody volunteer, what are something that you're not very good at? Just somebody else something. Toby.
Economics.
Okay, Toby's not good at economics, so this is going to be hard. But who feels like they're really good at economics? We need Ammon is what we need here. So if Ammon were here, he would say he's very good at economics. But so Toby, what's something you are very good at?
Volleyball.
Volleyball.
Oh boy.
Okay, he's good at volleyball. So who here is not very good at volleyball? Okay, so in a comparative advantage world. Somebody who is like really good at volleyball would pair up somebody who's really good with economics, and then they would both sort of use their strengths in some sort of way to balance out the needs that each have. So not every, Toby doesn't have to become an expert at economics and volleyball. He can rely on somebody over here to do economics, and that person doesn't have to rely on becoming an expert in volleyball. They can say, hey Toby, can you play volleyball for me on my team? And so that's sort of this idea that you actually work towards your strengths as a nation, and you don't spend time trying to preserve something that you're not really good at because there's somebody else that really can do it, and they can do it a lot cheaper and easier. And so you kind of work together. A lot of import-export policies are going to go and try to crimp that idea of comparative advantage, because there's certain industries or something they're trying to protect. So there can be good reasons and bad reasons about that, but that is going to be something that's going to come out a lot of this resolution as people are trying to modify laws to say, ooh, we need to protect this industry. And that should get in your mind, start clicking, click, think about, ooh, that's one of those economic fallacies we talked about last summer, and is that actually the best thing to do? And if you can start looking into the literature, you can start finding people talking about comparative advantage and supply and demand, and these other things that we've talked about this last summer in terms of what some of the harms of those things are. Because if you do crimp, say, the goods and services coming into our country so you protect an industry, does that come without a cost? No. What's the term you will use when someone talks about that?
Opportunity cost?
Opportunity cost. There's always a cost to whatever policy you're imposing with the government. Remember that term. You'll use that term frequently in your debates in defending against plans that are trying to crimp or to change some sort of law that makes something harder to get into our country or harder to get out of our country. Does that make sense? Okay. So that's sort of the last thing I'm going to say about economics. Thank goodness. And now we're going to talk about another favorite topic of mine, the U.S. Constitution. Okay, so who has the power? Don't be, yeah. So who has the power to regulate the import and export policy? You.
Congress.
Congress, good job. I'd have candy, I'll throw it at you. Okay, so let's go ahead and just look up, that's the right answer, but let's go ahead and look up the Constitution, because I think it's something we always should do when we're trying to find authority for something from the government. We should go back and actually look at the words of the Constitution and read them and say, oh, I see that these guys in the 1700s, this is what they said, they wrote, this actually means something today. So I need someone to look up Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1 of the U.S. Constitution. Just when you get it, raise your hand and start reading it. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1. There's no section numbers once you get into the section. See, it's the first paragraph. Article 1, Section 8. Okay, go ahead and read it out loud.
Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes, duty, imposts, and excesses, and pay the debts and provide for the common defense and the general welfare of the United States. But all duties, imposed, and excesses shall be uniform throughout the United States.
Okay, excellent. So that's, put that language up there. Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises. Okay, and I have little definitions of duties is really kind of the thing we're talking about with taxes on imports and exports. Imposts are taxes on imports, and excises is tax on manufactured sale and consumption of goods. So that gives it what kind of power? What kind of power comes out of this first section? Cody.
Money and imports and exports.
Taxes, yeah, being able to tax the imports and exports. That's correct. Okay. Next one, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3. I need someone to look up that. Somebody else got it?
Section 3.
Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3. It's good that you guys are looking at the Constitution. This is a good thing.
I think I have it. Which part? The
Clause
whole?
3. It's like the third paragraph down.
Is this the Commerce Clause?
I should say to regulate.
Yeah. The
Yeah.
Congress shall have power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes, and then this one, I can't read the rest
Yeah,
of it.
that's
But
fine. So to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. So importantly, is this resolution gonna have anything to do with state regulation of commerce? Or should say commercial, right? And then really the states have very limited authority, if any authority to get into this world. So I don't think we'll have the same problems we've had before with like state law having weird things that were, implicating federal law.
so we don't have to ask that if that's state evidence or federal evidence anymore.
So you don't have to ask that. You may, okay, so here's the trick. You may have to differentiate between international law and United States federal law. There might be EU stuff, there might be World Trade Organization stuff. Those things are not the same thing as having the same effect as federal law on our import and export regulations. Okay, one more, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18.
Which clause?
It's the last clause in Section 8.
18. Wow.
Somebody just read it out. Come on, we can get through this thing. I'm just gonna put the language up here. Somebody read it now.
To make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States or in a department or office thereof.
Right, so it's basically all the necessary and proper laws. So Congress has power to tax imports and duties and imposts and exports. They have the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations, including Indian tribes. And then they have this power to make all laws necessary to enforce and to do those things established above in these other clauses. So Congress has a lot of power to regulate import, exports, and international trade. Okay. So yes, the answer was, for the Constitution, was Congress. Okay, so what about the President? Okay? Okay, someone look Article 2, Section 2, Clause 2. Thought people, but I'll just put it up here. Okay, someone read that for me.
The president shall have power by and with the advice and consent of the Senate to make treaties, provided 2/3 of the Senate is present.
Okay, so the President does have some power in the international realm to make treaties after getting 2/3 approval with the Senate. Importantly, there's no specific power to make treaties or to make policy over international trade or commerce. So the President still has to go through Congress, but in terms of like international trade and making policy for the United States, there's no specific power of the President in the Constitution to do those things, to make into import or export regulation. Okay? The President may negotiate international agreement and treaties, but must ratify or pass law, but Congress must ratify or pass law to make that agreement binding. Okay, so if that is true, if all the power is vested in Congress, and we all agree that that's the case, it was the first answer from the guy who was up front here, then what about this statement here? Now this is from CNBC, so everything from CNBC is like wrong, but what do you think about this statement here? Is this true? Are they patently wrong in asserting this?
So if that was actually going to be just Trump doing that, it would actually be Congress passing it.
So here's the, and the question is, would Congress go along with it too, right? So here's a trick. So while the power is vested in Congress, Congress can delegate some of that authority to the President to modify tariff and rates, provided that it's done within certain prescribed limits. So this is kind of an interesting aspect of this resolution for this next year in terms of like topicality and like constitutional issues. Like we ran into this year where sometimes like someone would say they would do something, we're going to do this thing, and all of a sudden someone raise like a constitutional argument, right? And you'd be like, wait a minute, how's that coming here? This is an area where as people develop plans to regulate things, and in particular to give power to the executive branch and the President to do something, this should get your spider senses rolling about whether this is an unlawful delegation. So Congress can delegate to the president authority on the import and export rules that apply to the United States. It can't be an unlimited delegation. Okay? It gives the broad discretion to the president to act in particular circumstances, and then in the law, the actual law passed by Congress, it basically gives the criteria the president can use to make a decision. But it's not carte blanche, which is basically you can do whatever you want. Okay, some examples. So this is from the Trading with Enemy Act of 1917. It says, during the time of war, the president may, and then proceeds to say, mess with the property interests of foreign nationals. They can do all kinds of things, take their property, impound them. And we've actually seen, I think recently, the president using some of this authority as to who? Russia, a lot of those oligarchs. And you're wondering, how can the president just go around and grab these things and impound them? Well, it's not during our time of war, but the president has this authority embedded in the Trading Enemy Act to go off and to use the Treasury Department and other departments to restrict the use of these foreign nationals. Also, in the Trade Expansion Act of 1962, if the Secretary of Commerce finds that an article is being imported in the United States in such quantities or under such circumstances as to threaten to impair the national security of the United States, the President can take such other actions as the President deems necessary to adjust the imports of such articles so that such imports will not threaten to impair the national security of the United States. So again, Congress can lay out in law basically the criteria and the conditions for the president to act and then to impose different regulations on imports or exports. So it's not every single time that they want to raise a tariff or decrease a tariff, they have to pass a brand new law, depending upon the authority given to the president in existing law. Okay, so there are some things to be careful, and again, this goes back to the idea of, is there an unconstitutional delegation? So delegation will likely be upheld by the courts as constitutional so long as the statute allows the president to act as an agent of the legislative department rather than play a lawmaking role. And so, in other words, a constitutional delegation of tariff powers is one in which the president is simply asked to carry out the will of Congress as expressed in its statute. So looking at plans going into next year, listen very carefully to see, is the Congress giving the president basically unbridled authority, or are they giving them criteria to operate within certain confines? And it's kind of hard to kind of define this. You know, the analogy that came to my head is if I told Toby, you know, Toby, your little brother Blake, I'm going to give you total authority over him, and you now, well, you can now deal with his discipline and his education and taking care of him, and you can tell him whatever you do, whatever you say, he has to follow you. Okay? Yeah, and now that would be, in this parlance, would be an unlawful delegation because I'm completely abdicating my responsibility as a father to Toby. An example of it where it would be possibly okay is I say, we're going out to dinner between times of 6 and 9 p.m. You're going to be in charge, and here are the things you guys can and can't do. You can watch 1 hour of TV, you got to do the dishes, and you got to make sure you guys are in bed by 10:30 or something like that. That would be a lawful delegation because I'm giving him criteria that he can work within, giving him some discretion. Does that make sense? Okay, so there have been cases where Congress has given an unlawful delegation to the president, and it has come up back in the 90s. I don't know if this will actually come up in any of the materials that we'll be looking at, but in my research on this topic of the delegating of authority from Congress to the president in import-export law, this case came up from the 1990s. It's the Clinton versus City of New York, and it has to do with the line item veto. Oh, Toby, yeah?
So is the whole idea here with the Congress and the president thing is that, like, for certain tariffs, the Congress gives the president power to change them? Can Congress change them themselves?
Yes.
But they have to pass one law to do it.
So it can be either or both. So Congress can say to the president, we're giving you authority to move this tariff up or down 10% based on these factors. Okay?
Congress can say that. Can
say
Congress just move it up 10% by themselves as well? Or no?
Congress, or so they can give that discretion to the president today. Or they could say, you know, the president increases it 10%, and then Congress says, you know what, we want to decrease 20%. Congress could simply pass a law.
But they have to pass law to do that.
Yes, they would have to pass
Just to
a
go to the
law.
House and the Senate and then
Yes.
get signed by the president too,
Yes.
right?
And if anybody knows anything about the legislative process, it is horrific.
Slow.
It is very slow. So you can see why. So here's the other thing.
So basically, Congress just threatens the president to do things, and the president does it.
Say that again?
The Congress just threatens the president to make sure he signs the tariff off to how much they want, and the president does it.
Yeah, but think about what is Congress? I mean, Congress is like 500, 600 people, and it's a much harder body to move in a direction. So they might threaten we'll do something, but if the president's like, you got the votes. You got the votes to actually get that through. So I think trade organizations and businesses like the idea of giving the president some authority because it makes it faster. The government can be more nimble in responding to problems. So if there is like, I don't know, remember many years ago, Canada was dumping lumber in the United States, I guess. Like just putting tons and tons of really cheap lumber. I mean, that's crazy now. Think about even a piece of plywood, it's like $90. But they were dumping lumber and it was hurting our lumber industry. And so the president had authority to increase the tariffs on lumber so that the cost of lumber coming in would be more expensive.
Can you explain what you mean by dumping?
Dumping would be like, I don't know if there's a technical definition of it. It's just basically like if there's a lot of a product in Canada and they send it to the United States, our cost of lumber, let's say our plywood is $35. Well, they can make it in Canada because there's so much lumber up there, and they can sell it in the United States for $25. So if they're selling it for $25 in the United States because they have nothing else to do with it, and they might even be selling it for a loss because they have nothing else to do with it in Canada. They could be selling at $25. It's great for the consumer, but all the lumber companies that are trying to sell their product for a little bit of profit at $35, they're going to be out of business. And so the president imposed either sanctions or tariffs or some way of crimping that dumping of lumber in the United States to protect our industry. So anyways, the only place that I could find where there was unconstitutional delegation, where that authority was so broad that the court stepped in and said you can't give that delegation to the president, was in this line item veto thing, which is kind of weird. And basically what the line item veto did is after Congress has passed a law, they were going to give the president the authority to look at the law and then line out with a red pen the portions of the appropriation law that the president didn't like, and then write his name on the bottom, approve the rest, and make that law.
What?
Yeah, it was called.
What?
What? So the Congress would pass a law, but then the president would have the ability to do a line item veto, meaning rather than veto the entire bill and the whole thing has to go back to the House and Senate, he could simply line out individual portions of it, sign it into law, and it would become law without having to go through all the different processes. So that's the only place where this, and then the court stepped in and says, no, you can't do that. It's got to go through the entire Senate and House thing again, and the president can sign or veto, but he can't do an individual line item veto. Okay. So as we think about plans next year, I want you to be careful to think about a couple different things. So expanding president's authority to regulate international trade and commerce, and this gets into that unlawful delegation. So I think there's going to be plans dealing with looking at existing laws and saying how they are not expansive enough in terms of giving the president more authority. Congress has been doing more so in recent years, a thing called fast tracking. Have you guys ever heard of that? Basically, it's a process where instead of having to go through multiple committees and inside Congress, certain trade agreements can be fast-tracked, which basically means there's an agreement amongst Congress how certain trade agreements get approved. Rather than having lots of hearings and all these other things that normal bills go through, there's a really quick up and down vote, and then it gets up to the president. So there may be plans that seek to expand either fast-tracking or passing more laws that allow the president more discretion or authority so that he can decide whether to impose tariffs or to decrease tariffs in certain situations. There may be plans to contract the president's authority. There's a number of laws out there right now, which we'll probably learn about in the fall, that the president has current authority to make these kind of calls on whether do I increase a tariff or I decrease a tariff. And there may be calls to let's get him out of that completely. Let's make it more difficult to monkey with the free market, right? I mean, back to that flowing of water. The economists would say the best place is when there's government so out of it that the market just corrects itself. And so maybe the way you go is to say we need to pull the president's authority back. Don't give that discretion to the president. Put it back in Congress, which is really hard to pass things. Limit that authority, and that has all these economic benefits. So that kind of gets back down to some other ideas of breaking down barriers to free trade. Again, this is based on the economic theory that more efficiency means all economies grow. Raising barriers to imports and exports to facilitate particular national goals. And this is kind of interesting. It'd be interesting to see what happens this year with energy goals. I mean, I think we're feeling firsthand what it's like to have a lot of exports from other nations for our energy needs. And we have a lot of local ability to meet our own energy goals and energy needs, but we didn't realize how much we're relying on Russia, did we? Until they were no longer supplying to the world oil market, and now we're all feeling the pains of that. Military goals too. I mean, think about where do tanks and guns come from? Like, how do you make those things if you don't have local steel and aluminum plants doing that? So there's lots of different things that maybe if it's not the most economic idea, like it crimps the ability of goods flowing in and out of the United States. Maybe there's reasons to do that. Military reasons. Maybe we want to build our bombs here. We don't want to build them in China or in Russia, right? Because if we need those bombs to use against China or Russia, they're not going to send them to us. So those are going to be some interesting policy goals that we'll have to be exploring that will coming up this fall. But also look out for the retaliation of a trade war. This I think is going to be this is going to be a disadvantage in almost every case, I can almost guarantee you, in anything about imports and exports. And what I mean by trade war, does anybody have an idea what that means? Toby?
Like when Trump was president, he kind of cut off trade with China a little bit. And so China started cutting off trade with us and say, well, you're not going to trade with us, we're not going to trade with you. And so we don't have items and things go up in cost. I think that's what's going on right now with Russia.
Yeah.
The whole no gas and $8 gas prices and everything, that's a trade war.
Yeah, absolutely. So that I think is going to be, and again, it goes back to the opportunity cost. Every action you take in the government, every regulatory action you take has a counteraction to economically. So if you start cutting off trade with somebody else or restricting their goods to your nation, what are they going to do to your stuff? They're going to crimp it also, and they're going to reduce what you can do in your country, and that's going to cost jobs and things here. So I think it's going to be another huge disadvantage, probably to any case that looks to reduce trade or to put restrictions on the exports of other nations. So that's the end of my presentation. Are there any questions? I know it's kind of like meandering through constitutional